Amen. If you would, open your Bibles to Exodus chapter number 3. Exodus chapter number 3. Good to have you here. We're talking this morning about why introverts should go to church. And I'm glad you're here. Obviously, you're not an introvert, right? Because you're here this morning. Now, this is a very needed topic, why introverts should go to church. We've been kicking off a series. We kicked off a series 2 weeks ago called How Church Transforms Our Faith. And I believe that the very act of physically going to church will absolutely transform your walk with the Lord and revolutionize your faith. Going to church is not an optional thing. There are blessings that come from going to church. And this morning we're going to look at why introverts should go to church. Now, there are handouts. If you need your handout, please raise your hand out, and we'll get that to you. I forgot all about that. Thank you, gentlemen, for standing there patiently. Church is not an optional thing for Christians. In fact, the Bible tells us that we are to assemble ourselves together. In fact, the Bible never even assumes that a Christian would not want to spend time with other Christians. It's almost assumption when we go through the Pauline epistles that Christians want to stay with one another and want to be around one another. And over the coming weeks, we're going to look at some common objections, or you could say excuses that Christians come up with for reasons why they can't go to church. And as I said, whenever we miss church, it can stunt our spiritual growth, it can stunt our family's spiritual growth, and it could cause lasting harm to our relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. So this week we're looking at why introverts need church. Now, many of you in here are either an introvert or you know someone who is an introvert. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what an introvert is, all right? So we're going to take a little test. You ready? All right. Here's how you can know if you're an introvert. Number one, when someone asks you a question and how you feel about something, do you prefer to think about the answer, or do you begin responding before the person ever stops asking the question? How many of you have to think about the question? Raise your hand. All right. Now, evidently, you're not an introvert because you're raising your hand. Okay, that's good, though. All right. That means we're all in a safe space. All right. Number two, if you're in a small group, do you generally wait for someone to call on you, or are you the first one to speak up? How many of you you know what the answer is, and maybe you even have a burning in your heart to say something, but you are so introverted that you have to wait for somebody to call on you before you answer? Will you raise your hand? All right. Number three, how about the rare occasion when you're asked to teach a class? And already, you say yes, and your anxiety level goes up to like infinity. I'm going to teach a class. All right, you're asked to teach a class. Do you prepare every word carefully, or do you just kind of go in there and just like throw out your thoughts in the class? How many of you would almost write down everything you are going to say? All right, how many of you at work, that's what you do? When you go into meetings, you practically have this thing all laid out, and if anybody interrupts your flow, it throws you off guard. I'm like that. All right, number four. When you're working, do you need privacy, or do you thrive on the hustle and bustle of people and activity? How many of you, maybe you work in an open environment. How many of you work in an open environment where it's cubicles and it's just, you hear everybody yelling and talking at the same time all day long? That is not a place for an introvert. How many of you need privacy in order to get work done? All right. How about on Wednesday nights we do prayer requests, and sometimes we do testimonies in church. How many of you, if in church we say, if you have a testimony or a prayer request, raise your hand, and you have something on the tip of your tongue, but it takes all the strength and energy you have to just slither your hand up? Would you raise your hand? Yeah, I'm that way too. It's like I know what I want to say, and I know that I can say it, but just the act of raising my hand scares me to death. And then when I have to actually hear my voice coming out of my mouth, And it even scares me even more. And that's maybe a good sign that you're an introvert. Now, we have people in our overflow today. In the overflow, it's a little darker than it is in this room. And I would imagine that, and normally our church members go back there. If you have a child, they'll go back there. I would imagine that the people in overflow are probably disproportionately introverts, because they're in this place where it's a little darker, a little bit more intimate, and they get to look at a screen for the 40 minutes that I'm preaching. But there are introverts in our church, and it looks like, there's a good chance that that there's a significant population of introverts that go to our church. And I'd consider myself to be maybe more of an introvert, and my wife and I are both similar in that way. Let me show you a couple memes about introverts. I know you've seen these, but let me just kind of get us all in the same mode here, guys. If you could go to the next slide. Here are a couple memes about, go to the next one. Yeah. Here are a few memes about this. I have reached maximum people exposure level, must go and regulate. All right. When an introvert has to interact with other people, it takes all the energy and effort possible to talk to other people. Let's go to the next one. Whew, that was close. I almost had to socialize. This is where you see somebody and you know them, and you're already like thinking through what you have to say to that person. Like the introvert has a checklist of things that they say. They're not natural conversationalists. It's like, how's the weather? How was your week? Nice shoes you're wearing, or if it's a guy, nice hairdo, or your beard is really coming out nicely. And then when the introvert reaches the last question, it's nothing but like staring, saying, please carry this conversation. Go to the next slide. Being an introvert allows me to care about humanity and despise humans simultaneously. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. This is more of a pessimist. Okay, Brother Marty. This is more of a pessimistic introvert. It's like, I care for humanity, but I actually despise being around any of them. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, because that wouldn't be good for the neighbor next to you. Go to the next slide. You read my doormat. That's enough social interaction for one day. I mean, how many of you can relate to this? The truth is that 25% of the population consider themselves to be introverts. Introverts who have to live in an extroverted world. You can see in your notes, let me give you the three C's of an introvert. Number one, the first thing that an introvert hates, you can go to the next slide, guys. I have one more. Introverts unite separately in your own homes. Those would be all of our YouTube followers that are watching the service right now. I know some of you are sick, but I know there's at least one of you that woke up this morning and said, I would rather watch church in bed than actually be here, all right? That's for you. And I want you to stay here with us the whole service, all right? Unite separately in our own homes. Now, let me give you the three C's of an introvert. Number one, introverts hate crowds. An introvert hates crowds because they feel like they're exposed and vulnerable. When an introvert goes into a crowd, they feel like everybody is looking at them. They feel exposed, like everybody's looking at them and everybody is judging them. They would prefer to be alone and in a place where there's not a lot of buzz, like maybe a wake at a funeral. They don't want to be around a lot of stimulation. They prefer solace and peacefulness to charge up their batteries. Now, we're kind of in a unique situation. If you go back 150 years to what the Prairie Church looked like in New Braunfels, it was much different than what we have today. People worked out in the fields and the surrounding areas of our town, and the only thing they really interacted with were the cattle on the range, and maybe mom and dad and maybe an occasional neighbor. Now, that is an introvert's dream come true. That's paradise for the introvert. All week long, just talking to cattle who don't talk back and who aren't judging me. And the weekend was the time where these people would go to town, they'd go to to town, and that's when they would socialize. On Saturday they would go, they'd buy, sell, and trade. And then on Sunday, it was just the expectation that you would go to church. Now, if you're an introvert, you had 5 days to charge your batteries in preparation for church on Sunday. But things are a lot different today, aren't they? If you fast forward to today, the introvert has to interact with others in practically every area of their life. We go to work and we interact with the crowds and coworkers at work. And maybe you have an extrovert that sits next to you. You come in the morning and you've had your 5 cups of coffee, which means that you'll greet somebody with a glance and a nod, but that's about it. And you maybe have a cubicle mate who loves to talk, and they love to emote, and they have a whole lot to share, and you'd rather just not interact with the crowds at work. A lunch break, you would rather eat in your cubicle than go to the lunchroom. In fact, you don't even want to go to the lunchroom and get something out of the vending machine because you're afraid you might run into somebody who might want to talk to you. Some of you maybe are on the phone all day long and you're having to interact with people over the phone. That can wear you out. Then after work, you drive through town, and then you have to socialize with people at Walmart. You're fighting for parking. You're running into people that you know and trying to avoid them. And you're interacting with them, and the introvert, when they go to the cashiers and they're needing to pay for something, if there's something that's on sale and the cashier doesn't ring it up on sale, it takes every bit of energy for them to say, "Excuse me, that's supposed to be on sale." It just takes a lot of energy to do that. In fact, sometimes when introverts are forced to interact, they'll come across as very mean, because it's like, you forced me to have a conversation with you, so I'm going to just really hit you with this conversation. But you go to Walmart and you have to interact with people. At cashiers, you have to interact with people. You go home, pile your kids into the car, and then you have to go to the football game and sit beside the one person on the bleachers that wants to talk to you. Then you go home and you have to interact with your children. What a chore. Finish your homework. Get cleaned up, go to bed, stay in bed. And all the while you're on Facebook, liking posts, commenting on your friend's new hairdo, posting a Bible verse for a friend who's maybe having a hard time, and you're completely, all week long, depleting your resources. So different than the way it was 150 years ago. An introvert's dream to only deal with cattle. And now we live in a world that is crowded and expects us to be extroverts. And even when we think about going to church, there's this thought about the crowds of people. And maybe you're like this. It's like, if I'm going to go to Calvary, I know that the room's going to be too small. I know the hallway's going to be too small. I know I'm going to have to park my car out in the grass. I know I'm going to have to talk to the nursery worker when I drop off my kid. I know I'm going to have to find my kids, and then I'm going to re-find my kids several times before I can leave. And some people, some introverts, when they think of church, they just think of crowds, and they think of people. If you think about it from an introvert's perspective, it can be a hard thing to go to church because of the crowds. And then then when you get in the room, you're like, I'm focused and I'm ready to listen to the message. And then pastor says, hey, why don't you shake hands and tell people where you're from, how long you've lived in Texas. It's just all of these stimuli all week long. And then you get to church and you're having to fight crowds. Introverts don't like crowds. They'd rather watch and observe than participate. The second C about an introvert is conversations. They dislike conversations. In fact, they struggle to have casual conversations. It doesn't come naturally to engage in small talk. When an introvert is in a crowded room, there's this suffocating social aspect of having to carry on casual conversations. And the introvert loves to talk about deeper things, but they're not really good at just like having casual conversations. They're not natural conversationalists, which kind of gets us to our third point, the 3 C's of an introvert. They hate crowds, they They're not good at small talk. They're not good at conversations. And number three, they have complexes. You see, the introvert is a very inward-focused person. Whenever they talk to people, they leave the conversation and judge what they just said. And sometimes they even beat themselves up out of embarrassment and thinking, I said it wrong, or I should have said this, or that person had such a great conversation with me and all I did was nod. And see, many introverts, whenever they go to church, they just think of being completely defeated every time. They have a running monologue in their heads. The 3 C's of an introvert: hating crowds, disliking small talk, and having these kinds of complexes. Now, if you identify with this, you're not alone. 25% of the population says that they're an introvert. And an introvert, even a Christian introvert, must fight against the feeling of wanting to detach themselves from the local church. You see, in the local church, this is to be the place where Christians can be open and authentic. This is to be the place where the introvert can complement the extrovert, because an extrovert needs somebody to talk to, right? If 2 extroverts are talking, there's no one actually listening. And in church, this is the place where an introvert should be able to thrive. And I want you to thrive, and I want you to, when you're looking at 2018, I want you to think in your mind that not only am I commanded to be in church, but I want to be a participant in church. I want to be part of the church, and I want to engage in the calling that God has given me. Now, let me give you a couple reasons why you should go to church if you're an introvert. Number one, you should go to church if you're an introvert. Number one, because you are a God-given gift to the church. You're a God-given gift to the church. Now, you understand your disposition is God-given. Don't allow people to beat you up over it. Embrace it. You don't have to change who you are. You'll never be an extrovert, and that's okay. You'll never be comfortable working a room, kissing babies, carrying on small talk in a small group, or having casual conversations in the hallway. It's okay, because this is the way God has wired you. God has wired you to think and behave a little differently, and it's okay. And so the first thing I want to encourage the first thing I want to say is just to maybe encourage those who would consider themselves to be introvert, that you can stop the life-sucking task of trying to change the unchangeable. You should be okay with the way that God has made you. Embrace it. But you realize that as an introvert, God has made you has given the gift of introversion to the church. You're a gift to the church. If you were not here, there would be a hole in this place. 1 Corinthians 12:14 tells us that we are all fitly joined together. You can see in your notes, for the body is not one member, but many. The foot shall say, because I'm not the hand, I'm not the body. Is it therefore not the body? And if the ear shall say, because I'm not the eye, am I not of the body? Is it therefore not of the body? You can hear a person maybe in their own mind saying, you know what, I just don't click with anybody. I have a hard time carrying on conversations. I struggle having to shake people's hands. But God tells us that you and your unique attributes are a gift to the church. And when you're not here, there is a hole that is missing. Now, you can see the gift of the introvert. In your notes, number one, introverts are naturally burden bearers. Introverts are naturally burden bearers. They might not be good at small talk, but if you have a deep problem, they're willing to listen, and they're willing to get value out of helping you out. The gift of an introvert, number two, they focus on deeper issues through study. They are always questioning things, and they're the ones that like to study things out. That's a gift to the church. Number three, another gift is that an introvert develops deeper relationships with people. They don't want to be everybody's friend. They just want to find one friend. And they want to have a friendship with somebody that they can be completely open in and be able to share their heart. You see, that's a gift to the church. You see, the next one, the gift of the introvert is that they are a steadfast oasis in an extroverted society. If you're looking to identify the group of introverts, they're the ones after church, they're sitting someplace away from everybody else just staring at one another. That's how they interact, okay? They're completely okay not having to have 1,000 conversations going on at one time. It's a steadfast oasis in an extroverted society. And as I said before, the gift of the introvert is that they complement the extrovert. The extrovert is someone who, when you walk up to them, conversations just naturally pour out of them. They always have something to talk about. It comes to everything in their life just kind of comes to mind as they're talking to another person, and they need somebody to listen to them. When you think about the Bible, I think there's one man who really stands out, and he's found in Exodus chapter number 3, that really stands out as a man who I think we could consider to be an introvert. His name is Moses. Throughout Bible history, there's no greater figure or no greater leader than this man, Moses. And when you think about Moses, you think about him facing down Pharaoh or gathering the people on the banks of the Red Sea to cross it. You think about the waters parting and the children of Israel marching across dry land. You maybe consider Moses as the great leader who led the children of Israel across the wilderness, or who brought down the Ten Commandments. Moses is, I think, synonymous with a dynamic and effective leader. And when you look at Moses' life, I think you find that he wasn't much of an extrovert. He was more of an introvert. And his personality kind of shows up in Exodus chapter number 3. And I think it's something that we can all really relate to. Now, from the beginning of Moses' life to the end, it's a story of a man who is constantly hiding. Moses, when he was born, his mom hid him until he couldn't be hid any longer. And then she put him in a basket. He was raised in Pharaoh's house until he saw an Israelite being beaten. And then Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The Egyptians aimed to kill Moses, and he left Egypt and hid in a foreign land. And then as a shepherd in Midian, the Bible tells us in Exodus chapter 3 that Moses drove his flock to the backside of the desert. He didn't just take didn't take his sheep to the desert. He took them to the backside of the desert. I think he liked solace. Maybe your disposition is to find a more secluded place. Maybe your disposition is that you would rather be fishing on the banks away from everyone, or maybe curled up in bed reading a book away from everybody else. Moses could relate with you. And in Exodus chapter 3, you can see that the Bible says Moses kept the flock of Jethro and his father-in-law, the priests of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and he came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. You know, Moses was a man who was anonymous in the area in which he lived. No one knew him. He went to the backside of the desert, and he discovered God. Moses might have been anonymous with the people that were surrounding him, but no one is anonymous with God. And we find in Moses' life that he was a man that felt that he was not prepared for the task that he was given, but God prepared him. You see, an introvert is someone who has a gift that is given by God to perform a task that only God could do through them, which gets us to our second point. Why should an introvert go to church? Number one, because they're God's gift to the church. But number two, because God's gifts, a God-given gift, can become sinful if it's dwelled upon. A God-given gift can become sinful or distorted. Now look at Moses' life. He, in Exodus chapter number 3, beginning in verse number 11, is now receiving God's call. And he says in And Moses said unto God, who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, who am I? It was the excuse of comparison. Moses said, there are other people who could fit the extroverted bill of being the leader of the nation of Israel. Who am I? Look at chapter number 4. So God tells Moses, you're going to lead the children of Israel from bondage into the promised land. And in Exodus chapter 4, you can see Moses uses one word. He says, but. Moses answered and said, but, behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto me. First he said, go pick somebody else that is more of a natural fit. But number two, he said, people are not going to value my input. They're not going to respect me. They're not going to listen to me. The third thing I think that kind of illustrates Moses' personality type is found in verse number 10. So Moses is told that you're going to go and you're going to speak to Pharaoh. And look at verse number 10. And Moses said unto the Lord, O Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since that thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. You don't have to raise your hand, but how many of you that would describe like your conversations? I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. It literally means that his tongue was swollen, that he just had a hard time having things come out of his mouth. And he used the excuse of conversation. Lord, if you're going to pick a leader, if you're going to instill a calling in somebody, it needs to be an extrovert. It needs to be somebody that can just speak off the top of their heads and can carry on these wonderful conversations and can lead people through the power of their personality. You see, Moses, he had a God-given gift of introversion, but he allowed it to get to the point where it distorted his relationship. He allowed it to get to the point where he was actually sinning against God. God gave him a calling, and he came up with all kinds of excuses. Who am I? They won't listen to me. I can't think fast enough, God, for this kind of thing. The last thing is he would constantly refer, throughout the book of Exodus, he would refer to the children of Israel as your people. It's your people that are sinning. It's your people that are not obeying your command. It's amazing to see Moses. He was kind of projecting, if you will. He separated himself out from the children of Israel and said, they're your people, not my people. I'm not part of them. You see, you might have an introverted personality, but it can get to the place where it's distorted and it can become sinful, and you come up with excuses. It's amazing because Moses constantly referred to the children of Israel as your people until he got to Exodus chapter 34. And Moses said, we have sinned, and we are the people that are in need of your salvation. You see, as an introvert, we can come up with some excuses. We can say, God, you've caused me to be like this, and therefore I'm not a good fit for church. I'm a good fit for watching it on TV. I'm a good fit for watching my favorite program about church or reading my Bible by myself, but I'm not a good fit to be around other Christians. Understand, if you're saved, you're called to be around other Christians. It's a calling that God has given you. And if He's called you to do it, He will enable you to do it. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7 says, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. You see, being an introvert is God-given, but being fearful is sinful. And the Bible tells us that He has not given us the spirit of fear. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. Now, you might be here today and say, look, this is the way God made me, and because of that, I get to go cocoon myself away from other Christians. But that's not the case. God has called you to be a light and a testimony for Him in a lost and dying world. He's called you to step out of your comfort zone and step past your fearfulness and be around other Christians and be vulnerable and allow others to see who you are, and so you can encourage them. You know, Calvary needs introverts. Calvary needs introverts. Maybe that'd make a nice commercial, right? Oh, if you're an introvert, come to Calvary. We promise not to talk to you. 2 Timothy 1:6 says, "Wherefore I put thee in remembrance, that you stir up the gift of God which is in thee." You see, Christian, God's given you a gift. Stir that gift up. There are positives and negatives about it, but use that to connect to somebody who needs you. Philippians 2:13 says, "For it is God who worketh in you, both to will and to do of His good pleasure." If having those casual conversations seem to just drag you down and it pushes you away from others, tap into the power of God, knowing that He can strengthen you through it. Our God-given gift can become sinful. The third reason why Christians should go to church, or Christian introverts should go to church, number 3, is because God always empowers us for obedience. He always empowers us for obedience. Whenever you look at the book of Exodus, especially the passages found in chapter 3 and chapter 4, you find that God had a response to every excuse that Moses had. He says in Exodus 3, verse 11, he said, "Who am I? I am nobody special." Do you know what God said? Verse 12, "Certainly I will be with thee." It's not about you, Moses. It's about me empowering you to do that thing which you think you cannot do. Look at verse 14. In verse 13, Moses has this complaint. He said, I'm going to go before them, and I'm going to say that the God of my fathers sent me, and they're not going to believe me. In verse number 14, God says this, "I am that I am." I am in the present, I am in the past, and I am in the future. And you tell the children of Israel that you represent me. Continuing on in verse number 16, he said, God tells Moses in verse 17 that I will bring you out of the afflictions of Egypt into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and all the other ites that they needed to get brought out of. Moses was told that it was God who would perform it. Verse 19, Moses said, "And I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not by a mighty hand." But verse 20, God says, "And I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all of my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof." You see, anytime God gives you a command, even if it goes against your nature, and even if you have 1,000 excuses, God will enable you to get it done. God will enable you, even as an introvert, to share the gospel with a friend. God will enable you in those circumstances when you feel like you cannot carry a conversation. He will empower and encourage you to have the right words, to say the right things to the right people so that God can use you. God always empowers us for obedience. And in Exodus chapter 4, verse 12, when Moses said, "I have a fat tongue, I can't speak, I speak slowly, there's no way I can talk in front of a bunch of people, there's no way I can talk to people." Look at what God told Moses in verse number 12. "I will be with thy mouth and teach thee what thou shalt say." God is with you, and God is with us. And God empowers us to do the things that we need to do through obedience. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says this, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. You see, if you are a Christian here today, and you have allowed the excuses of your personality to keep you from church, understand that God will empower you to do the right thing. He'll empower you to follow through with obedience to Him. Now, we raised our hands at the beginning and indicated that perhaps some of us are introverts and maybe struggle with having casual conversations. And maybe in just a moment, you're already thinking, you know what, I'm going to have to shake Pastor's hand, and I'm going to have to come up with something to say. And I know what you're thinking. You're going to say, oh, Pastor, that was a really good message. And then you're going to fly away, right? You see, God will empower you to do the right thing at the right time. And as we dismiss here in just a moment, I want you to know that the people around you, many of them are introverts, and they need the encouragement of another introvert. There might even be some extroverts here who have a hole in their heart, and the hole in their heart is not having somebody to shut up and listen to them. You fill that void. The personality traits that God has given you are perfectly fit for the body of Christ. Are you using them today? Heads are bowed and eyes are closed.